September 14, 1944. Northern France. The air smells of diesel and earth. Captain John Garrett sits in the turret of his M4 Sherman, scanning the horizon through binoculars. The metal is hot beneath his gloves. 12 tanks idle behind him in a loose column, engines rumbling like distant thunder. The tree line ahead is dark, silent. Too silent. He's been at war long enough to know what silence means. His radio crackles. Battalion wants them to advance across the open ground, secure the ridge beyond. Standard sweep. Clear terrain. No reported enemy contact for 3 miles, but something in Garrett's gut tightens. The field ahead is perfect. Too perfect. A kilometer of flat farmland rising gently toward a wooded slope. Clean fields of fire. Good observation. The kind of ground a gunner dreams about. The kind of ground that swallows tanks whole. He lifts the radio handset. His hand hesitates. What he does in the next 60 seconds will decide whether 12 crews go home or become statistics. The wind shifts. Dust swirls across the road. Garrett closes his eyes and listens to a war he cannot yet see. By September 1944, the Allied breakout from Normandy had transformed into a race across France. The German Wehrmacht, shattered by months of attritional combat, retreated toward the Reich in broken columns. Patton's Third Army slashed through the south. Montgomery pushed toward the Low Countries. Everywhere, Allied armor surged forward, chasing a beaten enemy. But retreat is not surrender, and beaten does not mean harmless. The Sherman tank, America's armored workhorse, had carried the weight of this war from North Africa to the hedgerows of France. Reliable, mobile, produced by the tens of thousands, it embodied American industrial might. Yet every tanker knew its limitations. The Sherman's 75mm gun could handle most threats at reasonable range. Its armor, sloped and practical, offered protection against small arms and shrapnel. But against German heavy armor and anti-tank guns, the Sherman was outmatched. Crews called it the Ronson, after the lighter. Lights first time, every time. Tankers learned to speak in euphemisms. Brewed up meant burned alive. Bailed out meant you escaped before the ammunition cooked off. 5 men crewed each Sherman. Statistically, in heavy fighting, 1.2 of them wouldn't survive the war. Every tanker did that math in his head. The German 80mm flak gun changed the rules entirely. Originally designed as anti-aircraft artillery, the 88 had become the most feared anti-tank weapon on any front. Its high-velocity shell could penetrate a Sherman's frontal armor from over a mile away. The physics were brutal and simple. The 88's muzzle velocity exceeded 2,700 feet per second. At combat ranges, a Sherman's 3 inches of frontal armor might as well be paper. Worse than the gun itself was how the Germans used it. By late 1944, Wehrmacht doctrine had evolved into defensive mastery born of desperation. They positioned 88mm guns in carefully camouflaged positions along likely routes of advance. Hull-down placements, tree-line concealment, stone buildings with reinforced firing ports. The guns waited, silent and invisible, until Allied armor committed to open ground. Then they fired. The first round usually killed the lead tank. The second killed whoever tried to back out. Within seconds, an entire column could be burning, trapped between destroyed vehicles at the front and rear, unable to maneuver, systematically destroyed one by one. Crews called these meat grinders. After-action reports used the term ambush. The tankers who survived called it murder. American tank doctrine emphasized mobility and combined arms. Armor wasn't meant to slug it out with heavy guns. Tanks supported infantry, exploited breakthroughs, harassed supply lines. When properly supported by artillery, infantry, and air reconnaissance, Sherman units performed brilliantly. But in the chaos of rapid advance across France, combined arms coordination broke down. Units raced ahead of their infantry support. Artillery couldn't keep pace. Air reconnaissance focused on strategic targets, not tactical ambush sites. Tank columns found themselves alone, pressing forward on narrow roads through uncertain terrain, relying on speed and luck. By September, German forces had stabilized somewhat. The headlong retreat slowed. Defensive lines formed around key terrain. Officers who'd survived years of Eastern Front combat brought hard-won expertise to the Western Front. They knew they couldn't stop the Allied advance. But they could bleed it. They could make every mile costly. Every ridge, every village, every open field became a potential killing ground. The 743rd Tank Battalion had been in combat since D-Day +3. They'd fought through the Bocage, where every hedgerow hid a Panzerfaust. They'd supported the breakout at St. Lo, where the earth itself seemed to explode. They'd raced across France in August, covering more ground in weeks than some units had in months. They'd lost tanks. They'd lost friends. But they'd survived. Now, in mid-September, pushing toward the German border, they operated in the gray zone between breakthrough and stalemate. Intelligence reports were contradictory. Some said German forces had collapsed entirely in this sector. Others reported fresh units digging in. Reconnaissance was spotty. The battalion relied on speed, aggression, and the hope that the enemy was more broken than they were. Captain John Garrett commanded Charlie Company's 2nd Platoon. 32 years old, from Pennsylvania, he'd been a schoolteacher before the war. He'd trained at Fort Knox, learned gunnery and tactics, arrived in England in early 1944. He'd landed in Normandy in June with a new crew and a factory-fresh Sherman. By September, the tank had been replaced twice. The crew had cycled through 8 replacements. Garrett himself had survived 3 tanks brewing up beneath him. He'd learned what the manuals didn't teach: how to read terrain like a predator reads prey, how to sense wrong before seeing it, how to trust the reptile part of his brain that still remembered when survival meant reading danger in the shape of shadows. On September 14th, his instinct would be tested against the chain of command, against doctrine, against the momentum of an army that believed it was winning. The mission briefing that morning had been routine. Battalion wanted Charlie Company to advance northeast along Route Départementale 47, a farm road threading through rolling countryside toward the town of Verneuil. Intelligence reported minimal enemy presence. Reconnaissance patrols had found abandoned German equipment 2 miles ahead. Air observation noted no significant movement. The objective was simple: secure the ridge overlooking Verneuil, establish observation posts, hold until infantry arrived. Standard occupation mission, the kind the 743rd had executed dozens of times since August. But the briefing had been thin. Maps were outdated, some dating from 1938. Aerial photos showed fields and forests, but weather had prevented fresh reconnaissance runs for 3 days. Local resistance fighters reported German troops withdrawing through the area 48 hours earlier, but numbers and units were unclear. One report mentioned anti-tank guns. Another dismissed them as already evacuated. Charlie Company commander Major Douglas Henshaw emphasized speed. Battalion wanted the ridge by 1400 hours. Infantry would arrive by evening. Get in, dig in, hold. Simple. Henshaw was a West Point man, aggressive, confident, impatient with caution. He'd earned a Silver Star in Normandy for pushing through enemy lines when others hesitated. His philosophy was momentum. Keep moving, hit hard. Don't give the enemy time to set up. Garrett's platoon would lead the advance. 5 Shermans, his command tank, plus 4 others crewed by men he'd trained with, bled with, buried. Behind him would be 2 more platoons, 12 tanks total. They'd move in column along the road, then deploy into line formation when they reached the open approach to the ridge. Textbook, but Garrett had studied the map differently than Henshaw. The approach to Verneuil funneled through a natural bottleneck. The road descended slightly into a shallow valley, then crossed a kilometer of open farmland before rising to the wooded ridge. On both sides, higher ground. Good drainage meant firm soil, good trafficability. But it also meant excellent sightlines for anyone on the flanking hills or the ridge itself. During the briefing, Garrett had asked about flank security. Henshaw waved it off. Reconnaissance showed nothing. They didn't have time for elaborate maneuvers. Straight up the road, deploy, secure. Besides, artillery could suppress the ridge if needed. Air support was on call. They had all the advantages, except information, except certainty, except the one thing tankers needed most: knowing what was waiting beyond the next rise. The column rolled out at 11:30 hours. The weather was clear, temperature in the low 60s. Good tank weather. Visibility stretched for miles. The French countryside looked pastoral, almost peaceful, until you noticed the shell craters, the burned-out vehicles rusting in ditches, the crosses marking hasty graves. They passed through a small village at 11:45. A few civilians emerged, waving. An old woman offered apples. Children shouted in broken English. The local priest told Garrett's driver that Germans had left 2 days ago. "All gone," he said in French. "No more Boche." But when Garrett asked if he'd seen anti-tank guns, the priest's expression shifted. He glanced toward the ridge, then shrugged. "Perhaps. The big ones, on trucks. But they leave, I think. The two most dangerous words in war." The column continued northeast. The road narrowed, flanked by poplar trees and low stone walls. Garrett's driver, Corporal Andy Kowalski, kept a steady 15 miles per hour. In the turret, Sergeant Mike Davenport manned the 75mm gun, scanning left. Private First Class Eddie Marsh handled the bow machine gun. In the turret beside Garrett, Radio Man Corporal Lou Fisher monitored battalion frequency. Behind them, the other 11 tanks maintained interval. Engines roared. Treads clattered on cobblestones, then crunched on dirt as the road transitioned to compacted earth. Dust rose in plumes. Garrett could taste it through his scarf. At 12:20, they reached the edge of the valley. The road descended gently ahead. Beyond, perhaps 800 meters distant, the open farmland began. Beyond that, the ridge, dark with trees. Exactly as the map showed, Garrett called a halt. He needed to see this from outside the tank. He climbed out, dropped to the ground, walked 50 meters forward. The rest of the column idled behind him, engines grumbling. From ground level, the approach looked different. The farmland was recently harvested, stubble covering the fields. No cover whatsoever. The ridge rose perhaps 40 meters higher than the valley floor, its tree line thick and shadowed. On the left flank, a low hill with scattered farms. On the right, another gentle rise, also wooded. Perfect terrain for an ambush. Perfect fields of fire. Perfect kill zone. Garrett scanned with binoculars. Nothing moved. No glint of metal. No disturbed earth. No smoke. No birds taking flight. Just silence and stillness. His radio crackled. Major Henshaw's voice, impatient. "Charlie 2-6, what's the delay?" "Battalion's asking for status." Garrett pressed transmit. "Charlie 6, I'm observing the approach. Recommend we scout the flanks before committing to the open." Static. Then Henshaw's reply, sharp. "Negative, 2-6. Reconnaissance shows clear. We're behind schedule. Advance as planned. Acknowledge." Garrett looked at the ridge. He looked at his tanks. He looked at the men standing in turrets, waiting for his lead. He pressed transmit. "Charlie 6, request artillery prep on the ridge before we move." Longer static this time. Then Henshaw, anger bleeding through. 2-6, we don't have fire support allocated for this phase. No enemy contact reported. Do not delay further. Advance now. That's an order. Garrett stood on that road, binoculars in one hand, radio handset in the other, and felt the weight of decision settle over him like a lead blanket. Every second he hesitated cost momentum, but every instinct screamed danger. He climbed back onto his Sherman. His crew watched him, silent. They'd been together long enough to read each other without words. "Sir?" Kowalski asked quietly. Garrett stared at the ridge. The perfect kill zone, the silent tree line, the too quiet morning, and he made the choice that would save 12 tanks and end his military career. John Garrett had never wanted to be a hero. Before the war, he'd taught 8th grade history in a small Pennsylvania town. He'd coached baseball, attended church socials, planned to marry his sweetheart when he'd saved enough for a house. The war changed those plans like it changed everything else. What made him a good tank commander wasn't aggression or fearlessness. It was the same quality that made him a good teacher. He noticed details others missed. The student struggling in the back row. The question behind the question. The moment when explanation clicked into understanding. In tanks, those instincts translated differently but meant the same. Reading his crew's morale, sensing when the driver was fatigued before mistakes happened, Noticing the small anomalies that preceded catastrophe, he'd learned the cost of ignoring instinct in Normandy. July, during the push toward St. Lo, his platoon had been ordered to advance through a village intersection. Everything looked clear. His lieutenant insisted they move fast. Garrett had felt something wrong, but he was new, uncertain, unwilling to question authority. They'd advanced. The third tank in column hit a concealed anti-tank gun, killed 3 men instantly. The lieutenant's tank brewed up trying to reverse. 4 more dead. Garrett's tank survived by luck. But he'd learned the lesson written in burning steel and screaming men. In war, your gut is intelligence. Hesitation can save lives, and rank doesn't grant wisdom. Now standing in his turret on Route Départementale 47, he faced a different test. His gut screamed danger. His orders demanded advance. His career, his reputation, his relationship with command, all of it balanced against the lives of 60 men in 12 tanks. He thought about those men. Kowalski, his driver, a Chicago kid who wanted to open a garage after the war. Davenport, the gunner, a Tennessee farmer with 3 children waiting at home. Marsh and Fisher, both barely 20, both scared and trying not to show it. In the tanks behind him, dozens more. Friends, brothers, men who trusted him to lead them home. What was a career compared to that? He keyed the radio and gave the order that would change everything. The German 88 Miller flak gun had earned its reputation through brutal efficiency. But its effectiveness wasn't just about the weapon. It was about how Wehrmacht anti-tank crews transformed terrain into geometry of death. A properly executed 80-Waliber ambush required 3 elements: position, concealment, and timing. German crews had perfected all 3. Position meant selecting terrain that funneled enemy armor into predictable kill zones. Valleys, road intersections, bridges, open approaches to high ground. Anywhere attacking forces had limited maneuver options. The gunners needed clear sightlines across at least 500 meters, preferably more. They wanted overlapping fields of fire with at least 2 guns covering the same approach, ensuring that if one position was spotted and suppressed, the other could continue killing. Concealment was art and science combined. An 88mm gun, even with its low profile, was large and difficult to hide. Crews dug the gun into hull-down positions, exposing only the barrel and shield. They used natural terrain, tree lines, stone walls, building ruins, to break up the weapon's silhouette. Camouflage netting, cut vegetation, even civilian debris transformed the gun into part of the landscape. Crucially, they maintained discipline. No movement, no smoke, no premature firing. The first shot had to kill because it revealed the position. Timing was everything. Fire too early, and the enemy could reverse out of the kill zone. Fire too late, and they'd close to ranges where return fire became effective. The ideal moment was when the enemy column committed fully to the open ground. Lead elements too far forward to retreat quickly. Trail elements compressed behind them. Spring the trap when half the column was exposed, and the rest couldn't help. German anti-tank doctrine in late 1944 emphasized patience. Crews waited for targets of opportunity. Command tanks, recovery vehicles, ammunition carriers. Kill the leaders and the logistics first. Spread chaos through the formation. Then systematically destroy immobilized vehicles. The 88's ballistics made this devastatingly effective. At 1,000 meters, its armor-piercing round could penetrate 110 millimeters of vertical armor plate. The Sherman's frontal armor maxed out at 76 millimeters. The physics weren't complicated. The 88's shell hit with enough kinetic energy to punch through the armor, fragment inside the crew compartment, ignite ammunition, and turn the tank into a crematorium. Crew survival rates from direct 80mm hits hovered around 12%. Worse, the gun's high velocity meant crews often never heard the shot. The shell arrived faster than sound. One moment you were scanning terrain. The next, the world was fire and shrapnel. Against such weapons, Allied armor relied on combined arms. Artillery suppressed known positions. Infantry cleared potential ambush sites. Air reconnaissance identified gun positions before ground forces arrived. But in the fluid advance across France, These supporting elements often couldn't keep pace. Tank columns raced ahead, alone, vulnerable, dependent on speed and hope. En route départementale 47, the terrain offered textbook ambush geometry. The open approach to the ridge created a kill zone over 1,000 meters deep. The flanking hills provided alternate firing positions. The tree line concealed multiple potential gun sites. Any German anti-tank crew with tactical sense would recognize this ground as ideal. The only question was whether they'd stayed to use it. The M4 Sherman wasn't designed to duel German heavy guns. It was designed to be mass-produced, mechanically reliable and adaptable to multiple roles. In that mission, it succeeded brilliantly. By September 1944, American factories had produced nearly 50,000 Shermans. They'd fought on every front, in every climate, against every enemy. They were the reason Allied armor divisions could sustain operations when German forces struggled with chronic mechanical failures and spare parts shortages. But in direct combat against an 88mm gun, statistics told a grim story. The Sherman's frontal armor ranged from 51 to 76 millimeters depending on the variant and angle. Its sloped glacis plate offered better effective thickness, perhaps 90 millimeters at optimal angles. This provided protection against most German anti-tank rifles and lighter guns at combat ranges. The 80mm armor-piercing round, by contrast, could penetrate over 100 millimeters of vertical armor at 1,000 meters. Against sloped armor, penetration decreased somewhat, but remained lethal. At typical engagement ranges, 600 to 1,000 meters, the Sherman had no frontal protection against an 88. Side and rear armor was even thinner, 38 millimeters or less. A hit almost anywhere meant penetration. What happened after penetration was worse than the hole itself. The armor-piercing round fragmented upon entry, creating a cone of high-velocity metal shards inside the crew compartment. These shards killed or maimed anyone in their path. More critically, they ignited the Sherman's ammunition. The tank carried 90 rounds of 75mm ammunition and over 4,000 rounds of machine gun ammunition. Once fire started, secondary explosions followed within seconds. The Sherman's crew layout maximized this vulnerability. 5 men crammed into a small space. Driver and bow gunner in the hull, commander, gunner, and loader in the turret. An 80mm hit to the hull usually killed or incapacitated the driver and bow gunner instantly. Turret hits disabled the fighting crew. Even near misses could jam the turret ring or disable the engine, immobilizing the tank for follow-up shots. Crew survival depended on split-second decisions. Experienced tankers learned to identify the sound of an 88's impact versus near misses. They learned to bail out immediately before ammunition cooked off. They learned which escape hatches offered the best chance under fire. But in an ambush, with multiple guns firing simultaneously, these learned reflexes often didn't matter. The statistics bore this out. In heavy engagements against dug-in 88mm positions, Sherman losses could reach 50% or higher. The Sherman did have advantages. Its relatively lightweight, 30 tons versus the German Tiger's 56, gave it better mobility and lower ground pressure. It could maneuver across terrain that bogged down heavier tanks. Its lower profile compared to German heavies made it harder to spot at range. And its mechanical reliability meant that tanks lost to enemy action were often recovered and repaired, while German tanks broken down mechanically were often abandoned. But none of these advantages mattered in an ambush kill zone. Mobility didn't help when every direction was covered by fire. Reliability didn't matter when one shot turned the tank into a fireball. Low profile didn't help at 300 meters when the gun aimed directly at your hull. American tactical doctrine acknowledged these realities. Shermans weren't supposed to assault fortified positions without support. They were supposed to exploit breakthroughs, support infantry, and avoid set-piece battles with heavy guns. When properly employed with artillery and air support, Sherman units achieved remarkable success. But doctrine and reality often diverged. On a September afternoon in northern France, 12 Shermans faced the oldest problem in armored warfare. The terrain that looked safe was actually fatal, and the only way to know for certain was to advance and see if someone started shooting. Captain Garrett knew these numbers intimately. He'd seen Shermans brew up. He'd pulled wounded men from burning hulls. He'd attended memorials for crews who'd died before they could scream. The mathematics of penetration and kinetic energy weren't abstract. They were friends who'd been alive yesterday and were ash today. Staring at that ridge, he was doing calculations that had nothing to do with ballistics and everything to do with whether he'd rather face a court-martial or face the widows of men. He'd led into a trap. Military command structures exist for essential reasons: unity of effort, clear chains of authority, discipline under stress. Orders aren't suggestions. They're the skeleton that keeps an army from collapsing into a mob. Disobeying orders, even with good intentions, threatens this fundamental structure. Yet history is full of moments when disobedience saved lives that obedience would have sacrificed. Garrett faced the central paradox of military leadership. He'd been trained to follow orders, but also trained to think, to assess, to lead. His education at Fort Knox emphasized initiative within commander's intent. His combat experience taught him that tactical situations changed faster than communication could update. Good officers made decisions based on ground truth, not outdated information from miles away. But there was initiative within bounds, and there was flat refusal. Major Henshaw had given a direct order: advance, no delays. The order came with clear context. Battalion needed that ridge. They were behind schedule, and intelligence showed minimal threat. From Henshaw's position miles behind the front, relying on reports and maps, the decision seemed reasonable. Push forward, accept calculated risk. Win wars. From Garrett's position, looking at that perfect kill zone through binoculars, the calculation felt different. He considered compromise: advance slowly, scan continuously, be ready to reverse. But half measures in a potential ambush meant half his force would be in the kill zone when the guns opened up. Hesitant advance just made better targets. He considered calling for artillery prep despite Henshaw's refusal, using his own authority to request fire support directly from battalion. But that would be insubordination by another name, and would take 15 minutes to coordinate, time they reportedly didn't have. He considered requesting a reconnaissance element move forward first, 1 or 2 tanks to probe before the full column committed. But if those tanks triggered an ambush, they'd die to prove what his gut already told him. He wouldn't trade 2 crews' lives for certainty. Every option led back to the same choice: obey or refuse. The weight of command is knowing that your decision creates reality for everyone under your authority. Choose wrong, and men die who might have lived. Choose right, and you might save them. But if you're wrong in your rightness, you've sacrificed them for nothing except your ego. Garrett thought about the officers he'd known. Lieutenant Morrison, who'd followed every order precisely and gotten half his platoon killed in an avoidable minefield. Captain Reynolds, who'd improvised aggressively and won a Navy Cross for saving a surrounded infantry company. Major Sullivan, who'd hesitated at a crucial moment and allowed a German counterattack to succeed. Each decision, each outcome, each man still living with the consequences or buried because of them. Leadership, he'd learned, wasn't about always being right. It was about making decisions when all options were bad and living with the results. He keyed his radio and spoke words he knew would end his career. Charlie 6. This is 2-6. I am halting advance. Terrain is unsecure. I will not move forward without reconnaissance or fire support. Request you come forward to assess personally. The silence that followed lasted 3 heartbeats. Then Henshaw's voice, cold with fury: 2-6, you are in direct violation of orders. Advance immediately, or I will relieve you of command. Garrett closed his eyes briefly. Then, Charlie 6, I am refusing the order. I will not advance this column into unscouted terrain that presents extreme ambush probability. If you believe my assessment is wrong, come forward and lead the advance yourself. 2-6 out. He released the transmit button and waited for the end of everything he'd built. 1,000 meters away, hidden in the shadows of the ridge's tree line, Obergefreiter Klaus Weber listened to the distant rumble of tank engines and allowed himself a thin smile. Weber commanded one of two 88mm flak guns positioned along the ridge. His crew, 5 men, all veterans of the Eastern Front, had been in position since dawn. They dug in carefully, using the natural concealment of a collapsed farm shed to break up the gun's outline. Camouflage netting draped across the position. Cut branches covered the trails their tracks had left. From more than 200 meters, the gun was invisible. The second 88, commanded by Feldwebel Ernst Richter, sat 400 meters to Weber's left, similarly concealed at the forest edge. Together, the two guns covered the entire width of the approach. Overlapping fields of fire. Mutual support. Textbook defense, Weber's unit, Schwerheeresflakabteilung 277, had retreated across France for 2 months. They'd abandoned position after position, always one step ahead of the American advance, always managing to escape encirclement. But retreat wasn't flight. It was calculated withdrawal, trading space for time, making the Allies pay for every kilometer. 3 days ago, his battery commander had selected this ridge as a delaying position. Good terrain, single obvious approach, excellent observation. Their mission: hold until nightfall. Destroy as much Allied armor as possible. Then withdraw under darkness to the next position. Standard rearguard action. Weber had participated in a dozen such ambushes since Normandy. He knew the pattern. The Americans advanced confidently, expecting minimal resistance. Their tanks moved in neat formations, following roads, predictable. They relied on speed and firepower, assuming the Wehrmacht was broken, demoralized, fleeing. Sometimes that assumption was correct. Sometimes it was fatal. His gun crew had prepared meticulously. They'd ranged the killing zone with stakes at 500, 700, and 1,000 meters. They'd pre-sighted the gun on likely routes through the open ground. They'd stockpiled 40 rounds of armor-piercing ammunition within easy reach. They'd rehearsed their withdrawal route, a farm track leading deeper into the forest where trucks waited hidden. The plan was simple. Wait until the American column committed to the open ground. Let at least half the tanks advance into range. Weber's gun would target the lead tank, Richter's gun the rear. Cut the column, trap the center, methodically destroy everything caught in between. With luck, they could kill 10 tanks before the Americans organized effective return fire. Then withdraw before artillery or air support arrived. Weber felt no particular hatred for his enemy. This was mathematics, not emotion. Germany was losing the war. He understood that. But losing didn't mean surrender. It meant making victory as costly as possible. Every tank destroyed here was one less tank attacking the fatherland. Every day delayed was another day for new defensive lines to form, for civilians to evacuate, for diplomacy to find an alternative to total defeat. He was 34 years old. He'd been a civil engineer before the war, building bridges in Bavaria. Now he built kill zones. The skills translated oddly well. Through his gun sight, he watched the American column halt at the edge of the valley. He watched an officer dismount, walk forward, scan with binoculars. Smart, cautious. Exactly what Weber had hoped wouldn't happen. If the Americans advanced blindly, Weber's ambush would succeed perfectly. If they hesitated, called for artillery, sent reconnaissance, his position might be revealed before he could fire. And 2 guns against an entire battalion, with air support and artillery, was suicide. Weber watched the officer return to his tank, watched the column remain stationary, watched and waited, finger resting lightly near the firing mechanism, knowing that whatever happened in the next few minutes would determine whether he saw tomorrow. The Americans had numbers, supply, air superiority, industrial might. Weber had position, training, a powerful gun, and the desperation of a soldier with nothing left to lose except the time he could buy. He whispered to his gunner, "Range 900 meters, target lead tank, stand by," and the silent forest held its breath. Every soldier swears an oath to follow lawful orders. The concept is foundational. Without obedience, armies dissolve into chaos. Yet embedded within military law is a critical qualifier: lawful orders. Soldiers are not only permitted but required to refuse orders that are illegal, immoral, or obviously catastrophic. But what defines obviously catastrophic when you have seconds to decide and incomplete information? Garrett's dilemma embodied this ethical razor's edge. Henshaw's order wasn't illegal. Advancing on enemy-held terrain is the fundamental nature of offensive warfare. The order wasn't immoral. It didn't violate laws of war or target civilians. It was, on its face, a tactically sound command based on available intelligence. But Garrett possessed information Henshaw lacked. The ground truth. He could see the kill zone. He could feel the wrongness. His combat experience screamed that the intelligence was outdated or incomplete. Was that enough to justify refusal? Military. Law recognizes that officers on the ground must adapt to tactical realities, but it distinguishes between tactical initiative, modifying how an order is executed, and strategic disobedience, refusing to execute the order at all. Garrett had crossed that line decisively. If he was wrong, if the ridge truly was clear, his refusal would be seen as cowardice or insubordination. 12 tanks delayed for hours. Battalion plans disrupted. His career destroyed, possibly court-martial, potentially even charges affecting his men's morale and discipline across the unit. If he was right, if the ridge concealed an ambush, his refusal would save 60 lives. But he'd never be able to prove he was right. The enemy wouldn't spring their trap on empty air. His correct decision would look like lucky cowardice. The moral mathematics were impossible. Sacrifice your career and reputation to protect your men from a threat that might not exist, or obey orders and potentially watch your men burn to death to preserve military discipline. Philosophy offers frameworks for such dilemmas. Kant's categorical imperative. Act according to principles you'd want universalized. If every officer refused orders based on gut feelings, armies would cease functioning. But if every officer blindly followed orders despite battlefield reality, soldiers would die needlessly. Utilitarian ethics. Choose the action that maximizes good and minimizes harm. But how do you calculate when the harm is hypothetical? 60 potential lives versus one certain career. Virtue ethics. What would a person of good character do? But military virtue demands both courage and obedience. Which virtue takes precedence? In the end, Garrett's decision rested on something simpler and older than philosophy. The bond between a leader and those he leads. He'd shared canteens with these men, slept beside them in ditches, watched them write letters home, knew their fears and hopes and the names of their children. They trusted him to bring them home. That trust, more than any regulation or doctrine, defined his obligation. If he was wrong, he'd accept the consequences. Court-martial, discharge, dishonor, he'd bear it. But he wouldn't bear standing at 12 graves knowing he'd seen the danger, and advanced anyway because a manual said obedience outweighed judgment. Some decisions define who you are. Garrett made his choice knowing it might destroy him, but knowing also that the alternative would destroy something more fundamental than his career. It would destroy his ability to live with himself. The radio crackled with Henshaw's furious voice demanding compliance. Garrett switched off the battalion frequency and keyed his platoon net instead. All Charlie 2 units, this is 2-6. We're pulling back 500 meters and going hull down. Davenport, scan that ridge continuously. If you see anything, reflection, movement, smoke, you sing out immediately. We're going to wait for infantry or artillery before we move another inch. His driver, Kowalski, glanced back at him. Sir, Major Henshaw's gonna have your ass. Garrett nodded slowly. Probably. But at least you'll all be alive to testify at my court-martial. The column reversed carefully, backing down the road until a slight rise provided cover. 12 Shermans took up defensive positions, guns trained on the silent ridge, and Captain John Garrett sat in his turret, binoculars raised, watching for the enemy he couldn't see but knew was there, waiting to learn whether his career-ending decision had been the right call or the biggest mistake of his life. 20 minutes passed in silence, broken only by the idle rumble of engines, and the metallic click of ammunition being checked and rechecked. Garrett kept his binoculars fixed on the ridge. His eyes ached, his neck cramped, but he didn't lower the glasses. Behind him, his platoon waited. No one questioned the halt. They'd learned to trust Garrett's instincts. If the captain said danger, they believed him. But Garrett could feel the tension building. How long could he hold position in defiance of direct orders? How long before Henshaw arrived personally, relieved him on the spot, ordered the advance anyway? At 12:47 hours, his radio crackled on the platoon frequency. Lieutenant Ben Kowalski, no relation to his driver, commanded the 3rd tank. His voice came through tight with tension. 2-6, this is 2-3. I've got movement on the ridge, left side of the tree line. Thought I saw a reflection. Can't confirm. Garrett swung his binoculars left. The ridge stretched away, dark with pines and oaks, shadows deep where the sun couldn't penetrate. He scanned methodically, section by section. Nothing. But absence of evidence wasn't evidence of absence. All units maintain watch, Garrett transmitted. Nobody fires unless fired upon or I give the word. These might be civilians or retreating troops. Watch and wait. Minutes crawled by. The sun climbed higher. Heat shimmered off the distant fields. At 12:52, Sergeant Davenport, Garrett's gunner, spoke quietly beside him. "Sir, I've been staring at that ridge for half an hour. There's something off about those shadows near the collapsed building, left side, about 300 meters in from the road. The shadows don't match the sun angle. Could be nothing. Could be camouflage." Garrett studied the spot. A ruined farm structure, stone walls partially collapsed, roof line sagging, trees close behind it. The shadows did look odd, but maybe that was just the building's irregular shape. Or maybe it was a gun position. Before he could respond, new voices erupted on the battalion frequency. He'd muted it, but Fisher, monitoring both nets, suddenly spoke urgently. "Sir, infantry reported engaging German rearguard elements 2 miles northeast. Estimated platoon-sized unit with anti-tank weapons. They're requesting armor support to suppress enemy positions." Garrett's stomach went cold. 2 miles northeast, exactly the direction the ridge pointed. Not abandoned territory. Active enemy. And if infantry 2 miles away was engaging German forces, what did that suggest about the ground immediately ahead? He keyed the battalion frequency, knowing Henshaw would be listening. "Charlie 626. Report of enemy contact 2 miles ahead confirms unsecure terrain. Request immediate reconnaissance or artillery before we advance." Henshaw's response came back fast, clipped, but with less anger than before. The report of enemy contact had shifted the tactical picture. 2-6, hold position. I'm coordinating with fire direction. Stand by. Garrett exhaled slowly. Small vindication. Not enough to save his career, but enough to prove he hadn't been paranoid. His crew relaxed slightly. Kowalski glanced back again. "Good call, sir." But Garrett couldn't relax. Those shadows, that reflection. His instinct still screamed. At 12:58, the world changed. On the battalion frequency, a new voice cut in. 2nd Platoon of Able Company, advancing on a parallel route half a mile south. Their transmission was routine at first. "Charlie 6, Able 26. We're approaching phase line Delta, preparing to advance across..." The transmission cut off abruptly. Then chaos. "Contact! Contact! Anti-tank fire! Jesus Christ, they're everywhere! Baker 3 is hit! He's burning! We need..." The sound of explosions carried faintly through the air from the south. Multiple booms rolling like thunder. Black smoke rose into the clear sky. The radio dissolved into overlapping voices, shouting, screaming, the unmistakable sound of men dying. Garrett's blood turned to ice. Able Company's route ran parallel to Charlie's, offset by maybe half a mile through similar terrain. They'd been advancing toward a different ridge, but the same enemy. Same tactics, same ambush. The radio chatter came in fragments. 88s in the tree line, at least 3 guns. Can't back out, Johnson's tank is blocking. Bail out, bail out. Then Major Henshaw's voice, trying to impose order. All able units, withdraw immediately. Artillery fire mission inbound. All Charlie units, hold position. Do not advance, repeat, do not advance. Garrett felt the confirmation like a physical blow. If he'd obeyed, if he'd pushed his column across that open ground, they'd be the ones on the radio now. Burning, dying, screaming into static. His hands were shaking. He pressed them flat against the turret rim, willing them still. Fisher looked at him with wide eyes. "Sir, if we'd gone forward—" "Don't," Garrett said quietly. "Don't think about it. Stay focused." But he couldn't help thinking about it. 12 tanks, 60 men. All of them would have driven straight into the kill zone he'd sensed but couldn't prove. All of them would be dead or burning because he'd followed an order based on faulty intelligence. The radio continued its symphony of disaster. Able Company was being shredded. First reports indicated 4 tanks destroyed outright, 2 more immobilized, crews attempting to bail out under fire. Casualties unknown but presumed heavy. Artillery fire began landing on Abel's ridge. Too late. Always too late. The German guns would already be withdrawing, mission accomplished, moving to the next ambush site. They'd killed or disabled half a company in under 3 minutes and would vanish before effective counter-battery fire arrived. At 13:05, Henshaw's voice came through on Charlie Company's frequency, all the anger gone, replaced by something harder and colder. Charlie 2-6. "This is 6. Your assessment was correct. The ridge ahead is presumed hostile. We're bringing up infantry and artillery for a coordinated advance. Maintain your position. We'll discuss your actions later." Out. Garrett didn't respond. There was nothing to say. He trained his binoculars back on his ridge, the one his company hadn't died on. Those shadows, that reflection, he was certain now. German 88s were dug in, waiting. They'd watched his column halt and hesitate. They'd waited for him to advance. When he hadn't, they'd stayed silent, hoping another target would appear, and it had. Able Company on the parallel route, less cautious or more obedient. The Germans had killed them instead. Garrett should have felt relief, vindication. His decision had saved his men, but all he felt was hollow. Able Company's crews were dead or dying because they'd followed their orders. His crews were alive because he'd refused his. The moral mathematics of war made no sense. Courage and obedience got you killed. Disobedience and luck kept you breathing. Where was the justice in that? Beside him, Davenport spoke quietly, still scanning the ridge. "Sir, if those guns are still up there and we've stopped, they know we know. What if they relocate and hit us while we're sitting here?" Garrett had thought of that. The Germans were smart enough to shift positions once their presence was suspected. His company sat exposed on low ground. If those 88s maneuvered to a flank, he keyed the company frequency. "All Charlie units, maintain hull-down positions, but stay alert on all quarters. Scan for flanking fire. Drivers, be ready to move on my command." Then he waited, eyes burning from strain, scanning the ridge and the flanking hills and the 1,000 places death could emerge from, while smoke from Able Company's funeral pyre drifted south on the afternoon breeze. Artillery arrived at 13:20 hours. 8 105mm howitzers from the Divisional Artillery Battalion opened fire on Garrett's ridge, walking shells from the tree line back 300 meters into the forest. The ground erupted in geysers of earth and shattered trees. Smoke billowed. The barrage lasted 5 minutes. Systematic, devastating, thorough. Garrett watched through binoculars, searching for secondary explosions that would indicate an ammunition dump or destroyed gun position. He saw none. Either the Germans had already withdrawn, or they'd dug in deep enough to survive the barrage. When the artillery ceased, the ridge smoked like a volcano, but silence returned quickly. No movement, no return fire. The forest might be empty or might conceal a dozen guns. There was only one way to know. At 13:35, infantry arrived, 2 platoons from Baker Company, 115th Infantry Regiment. They'd been pulled from reserve and rushed forward after Able Company's catastrophe. Their lieutenant, a young officer named Thomas Hewitt, conferred with Garrett briefly. "We'll advance in dispersed formation," Hewitt explained, gesturing at the ridge. "If there's guns up there, they'll hold fire on infantry and wait for armor. That's when you hit them. We flush, you kill. Basic combined arms." Infantry drew fire, armor suppressed it. "Simple in theory, brutal in practice," Garrett nodded. "My guns will cover you the whole way. You see anything, you call it out immediately. Don't try to be heroes," Hewitt smiled thinly. "Same to you, Captain." At 13:40, the infantry moved out. 60 men in 2-man buddy teams spread across 300 meters of front, advancing through the stubbled fields toward the ridge. They moved in bounds, one man running while his partner covered, then switching. Textbook, Garrett's 12 tanks remained hull down, guns trained on the tree line. Every commander, every gunner, every bow gunner watched the forest for muzzle flashes, for movement, for any sign of the enemy. The infantry reached the halfway point. Nothing. 700 meters from the ridge now. Still nothing. Garrett's tension ratcheted higher. If the Germans were still there, they were showing incredible discipline. Most crews would have withdrawn after the artillery barrage. Staying in position under those circumstances required either fanaticism or orders more inflexible than self-preservation. At 500 meters, the infantry slowed. Lieutenant Hewitt's voice came over the inter-unit frequency. "Approaching phase line echo. No contact yet. Terrain looks—" The ridge erupted, not 88-minute fire. They were saving that for armor, but machine guns. Multiple MG-42s opened up simultaneously from concealed positions along the tree line. The sound was distinctive, a high-pitched buzz like ripping canvas, firing at 1,200 rounds per minute. The fields erupted in geysers of dirt as tracers laced through the infantry formation. Men dropped, diving for cover in shallow furrows. Others returned fire, rifles cracking, but the Germans were dug in and invisible. Garrett reacted instantly. "All units, suppressive fire on the tree line. He rounds area saturation. Fire at will." 12 Sherman main guns opened fire nearly simultaneously. High explosive shells screamed across the valley and detonated in the forest. Trees shattered. Smoke billowed. The Shermans fired as fast as loaders could cycle rounds. 5 seconds between shots. Systematic, overlapping, walking fire across the entire suspected enemy position. The German machine guns faltered, then resumed. Disciplined. Professional. They shifted fire to the tanks, bullets pinging harmlessly off armor, trying to suppress the suppression. That's when the 88s revealed themselves. The first shot screamed out of the smoke-shrouded tree line and missed Garrett's tank by 10 meters, impacting the ground behind him with a concussion that rattled his teeth. The second shot, a heartbeat later, hit Lieutenant Kowalski's tank, 2-3 in the formation, striking the frontal glacis plate at an angle. The round ricocheted, deflecting off the sloped armor in a shower of sparks. Pure luck, 6 inches different and it would have penetrated. Kowalski's voice came over the radio, shaken. "Taking fire. I'm okay, tank's okay, but Jesus. 2-3, back out of position now," Garrett ordered. "All units, displace 50 meters, alternating by section. Don't give them a static target." The Shermans began a choreographed withdrawal. Odd-numbered tanks reversing while even-numbered provided covering fire, then switching. Movement made them harder to hit and forced the German gunners to constantly readjust aim. Another 88mm round shrieked overhead, then another, impacting where tanks had been seconds before. Garrett counted muzzle flashes through the smoke. 2 guns, maybe 3, exactly as he'd suspected. "Fire direction, this is Charlie 2-6, he shouted into the battalion frequency. Enemy anti-tank guns confirmed on Ridge 119. Coordinates as follows. He rattled off the grid references while Davenport continued pumping He rounds toward the German positions. The artillery, still on station, adjusted fire. 30 seconds later, 105mm shells began landing directly on the suspected gun positions. The barrage was immediate, accurate, devastating. The ridge disappeared under a curtain of explosions. The 80mm fires ceased abruptly. In the sudden relative quiet, Garrett heard Lieutenant Hewitt's voice, strained but controlled. "Charlie 2-6, able infantry, we're pulling back. We've got 3 wounded, need covering fire." "You've got it," Garrett confirmed. "All units, continue suppression. Infantry, withdraw on my fire." The Shermans resumed firing methodically, giving the infantry time to grab their wounded and retreat across the open ground. The Germans didn't pursue. They'd lost the ambush advantage and now faced coordinated combined arms fire. Their best option was withdrawal while they still could. By 13:55, the infantry reached friendly lines. Casualties: 3 wounded, none killed. Lucky. If the Germans had opened fire at 300 meters instead of 500, the casualties would have been catastrophic. The artillery continued pounding the ridge until 14:10, then lifted. Smoke drifted across the scarred tree line. The forest burned in scattered patches. At 14:25, Major Henshaw's voice came through. "All Charlie units, advance and secure Ridge 119. Infantry will accompany. Proceed cautiously." This time Garrett obeyed. With infantry support, artillery on call, and the German positions suppressed, the advance carried acceptable risk. The column moved forward slowly, infantry alongside, guns scanning continuously. They reached the ridge at 14:45. The German gun positions were empty. Shell craters pocked the earth. Camouflage netting hung in shreds. Spent 88mm casings littered the ground, evidence of how many rounds had been fired at Able Company. But the guns themselves were gone, withdrawn during the artillery barrage via carefully prepared escape routes. The Germans had vanished like ghosts, leaving only destruction in their wake. Garrett dismounted and walked the positions. 2 gun emplacements, exactly as he'd estimated, with perfect fields of fire over the kill zone. If his column had advanced as ordered, they would have driven straight into this. 12 tanks, sitting targets, methodical murder. He found drag marks where the guns had been hauled away by half-tracks. He found foxholes where infantry had waited to protect the guns. He found abandoned ammunition crates and a single blood-stained helmet, evidence that the artillery had claimed at least 1 German life. But mostly he found confirmation. His instinct had been right. The ambush had been real. His disobedience had saved 60 men. He should have felt vindicated. Instead, he felt exhausted. Sergeant Davenport approached, lighting a cigarette with shaking hands. "Hell of a day, sir." "Yeah," Garrett said quietly, staring at the tree line where death had waited patiently for targets that never came. Behind them, the company secured the ridge, establishing defensive positions, calling in coordinates, preparing for the night. The mission was accomplished. The ridge was taken. The war continued its grinding advance toward Germany, and Captain John Garrett stood in an empty German gun position, knowing he'd saved his men and probably destroyed his career, and wondered if those 2 things were forever inseparable. The smoke drifted. The sun descended. Evening approached. And 12 Shermans sat silent on a ridge that should have been their graveyard, testament to the value of one man's refusal to obey. The debriefing occurred 3 hours later in a hastily established battalion command post in Verneuil. The town had been secured by nightfall, the German rearguard withdrawing eastward. Baker and Charlie companies dug in on the ridge. Able Company counted its losses. 6 tanks destroyed, 11 men killed, 14 wounded. Half a company shattered in 3 minutes. Captain Garrett reported to Major Henshaw's CP at 1900 hours. He expected a court-martial. Instead, he found Henshaw sitting behind a folding table, maps spread before him, looking 10 years older than he had that morning. "Sit down." "Captain," Henshaw said quietly. Garrett sat, back straight, prepared for whatever came next. Henshaw studied him for a long moment, then spoke. "Your refusal to obey my direct order this morning constitutes insubordination. By regulation, I should bring charges. Garrett nodded. Yes, sir. Your assessment of the tactical situation proved correct. Your instinct saved 12 tanks and 60 men. If you'd obeyed, Charlie Company would have suffered the same fate as Able. Yes, sir. Henshaw leaned back, rubbing his face with both hands. He looked exhausted. I've been in the Army 16 years, Captain. West Point, peacetime garrison, then this war. Everything I've learned says the chain of command is absolute. You disobey orders, the whole system falls apart. Garrett remained silent, unsure where this was leading. But I've also learned something else these past few months, Henshaw continued. I've learned that maps lie, intelligence is often wrong, and the officer on the ground sees things that those of us in command posts can't. You saw something I didn't. You trusted your instinct over my orders, and you were right. He paused, then said slowly, If I court-martial you, I'm telling every officer in this battalion that obedience matters more than judgment. That following a bad order is better than making the hard call. I'm not sure I want to send that message. Garrett felt something unclench in his chest, but he kept his expression neutral. Henshaw picked up a report from the table. Colonel Morrison wants a full report on today's action. I'm going to write that you exercised tactical discretion based on ground observation that contradicted available intelligence. I'm going to write that your initiative prevented catastrophic losses, and I'm going to recommend you for a Bronze Star. Garrett blinked. Sir, Don't thank me yet, Henshaw cut him off, because I'm also going to write that you placed me in an impossible position, that your refusal could have undermined discipline and cohesion, that this cannot become standard practice. You made the right call this time, Captain. But if every officer starts second-guessing orders based on gut feelings, we stop being an army and become a mob. He stood, walked to the window, stared out at the darkening town. Command is about balance. Trust subordinates enough to let them adapt. Trust them too much and you lose unity of effort. I trusted intelligence over your judgment today. That was my mistake. But you trusted your gut over the chain of command. That was your risk. He turned back to Garrett. We were both right. We were both wrong. Welcome to the moral gray zone that is military leadership. Garrett absorbed this slowly. Not a court-martial. Not quite vindication either. Something more complex. Acknowledgement that war defies easy answers. What happened to Able Company? He asked quietly. Henshaw's expression darkened. Captain Lewis is dead. His tank took a direct hit, cooked off immediately. 5 other tanks destroyed beyond recovery. 11 men dead, 14 wounded. They're pulling back to refit, absorbing replacements. They'll be combat effective again in a week. Combat effective. The sanitized language of war. As if losing 11 friends could be offset by 11 strangers. Did we kill any of the German gunners? Garrett asked. Artillery thinks they got 2 or 3, but the guns escaped. They'll be waiting somewhere else tomorrow, killing someone else's company. The futility of it settled over the room like dust. You win a tactical victory. The enemy retreats. Tomorrow the same battle repeats with different coordinates and different names on the casualty lists. The war grinds forward, indifferent to individual survival. Your platoon performed well today, Henshaw said, shifting to safer ground. Your crews showed discipline during the halt and excellent fire control during the engagement. Your instinct saved them. Their training kept them effective. That's the combination that wins wars. He extended his hand. You're a good officer, Garrett. You've got the hardest kind of courage, the courage to be right when it costs you. But don't make a habit of refusing orders. Eventually you'll be wrong, and then we'll both regret it. Garrett shook his hand. Understood, sir. Dismissed. Get some rest. Tomorrow we push toward the German border. Garrett left the CP and walked through the darkened town toward his company's assembly area. The streets were empty except for sentries and the occasional medic moving between aid stations. Somewhere in the distance, artillery rumbled. The war's endless percussion. He found his crew bedded down beside their Sherman, heating rations over a small fire. They looked up as he approached, questions in their eyes. Well? Kowalski asked. No court-martial, Garrett said, settling down beside the fire. Bronze Star recommendation. And a lecture about balance and judgment, Davenport snorted. "So you saved our asses and got a medal. Sounds about right." "I got lucky," Garrett corrected. "If those guns hadn't been there, I'd be facing charges." "But they were there," Fisher said quietly. "You knew. We trusted you. That's why we're still here." The simple truth of it hit Garrett harder than expected. They'd trusted him. He'd trusted his instinct. This time both bets paid off. Next time, who knew? War was a lottery where experience and skill improved your odds, but never guaranteed outcomes. They ate in comfortable silence, men who'd faced death together and survived to eat another meal. Tomorrow they'd advance again. Tomorrow new dangers would emerge. But tonight, beside a small fire in a liberated French town, they were alive. That was enough. Word of Charlie Company's non-advance spread through the battalion within hours. In the strange oral tradition of armies, the story evolved with each retelling. Some versions had Garrett physically standing down Major Henshaw. Others claimed he'd spotted the German guns through divine intuition. A few suggested he'd simply gotten cold feet and been lucky when Able Company proved the danger. The truth, as usual, was less dramatic than legend. But the impact was real. Tank commanders throughout the battalion began questioning orders more openly, demanding better reconnaissance, insisting on combined arms support before advancing into uncertain terrain. Some officers viewed this as healthy skepticism. Others saw it as erosion of discipline. The debate continued in command tents and over field rations for weeks. Lieutenant Colonel Morrison, the battalion commander, eventually issued a directive that attempted to thread the needle. Officers were expected to follow orders but were also responsible for assessing tactical situations and communicating concerns. Refusal to obey required immediate justification. Initiative within commander's intent was encouraged. Blanket disobedience was unacceptable. The directive satisfied no one and clarified little, but it represented the best compromise between doctrine and reality, an acknowledgement that war was too complex for absolute rules. For Able Company, the aftermath was grimmer. They absorbed 16 replacements, fresh-faced crews straight from training battalions, wide-eyed and terrified. The veterans, survivors of the ambush, were hollow-eyed and distant. They didn't talk about what happened on that ridge. They didn't need to. The smoking hulks of their Shermans, still being recovered from the kill zone, told the story. Captain Lewis's replacement, Captain Robert Hendricks, faced the unenviable task of rebuilding unit cohesion, while veterans mourned friends and replacements tried to prove themselves. Morale, never easily measured, had fractured. Trust in intelligence reports evaporated. Confidence in command decisions wavered. It would take weeks, more combat, more losses and victories, before Able Company regained its combat effectiveness. Some crews would never fully trust the terrain ahead. Some would hesitate at crucial moments, paralyzed by memories of that ambush. Others would become recklessly aggressive, trying to kill the enemy before the enemy killed them. Trauma reshapes units as surely as it reshapes individuals. Able Company had been broken and hastily glued back together. The cracks would show for months. Meanwhile, the German gunners who'd sprung the ambush withdrew eastward. Mission accomplished. Obergefreiter Weber's crew reached their next defensive position 20 miles closer to Germany. They'd destroyed 6 American tanks and killed or wounded dozens of enemy soldiers. By the standards of late-war rearguard actions, this constituted success. But Weber knew the mathematics. 6 tanks destroyed today would be replaced within a week. The Americans had endless reserves, endless production, endless willpower. Germany had desperation and expertise and weapons that killed effectively, but couldn't alter the war's trajectory. He'd survive another week, another month, maybe even reach the Rhine. But the end was inevitable. The only question was how many more ambushes, how many more American crews killed before the final surrender. It was a calculus of futility, and Weber understood it perfectly. But orders were orders. The guns would be positioned. The next kill zone prepared. The next American column would advance, and perhaps this time, their commander wouldn't hesitate. The war ground forward. By October, the 743rd Tank Battalion reached the German border. They'd fought through September's weather, through constant resistance, through minefields and ambushes and desperate counterattacks. Charlie Company lost 3 tanks in that advance, not to ambushes, but to mines, mechanical failure, and one unlucky encounter with a Panther tank that cost 2 Shermans before. Artillery killed it, Captain Garrett continued, leading his platoon with the same mix of aggression and caution that had saved them in September. He earned his Bronze Star in a quiet ceremony where Major Henshaw pinned the medal on his chest and said nothing about insubordination or instinct. Only, "Well done, Captain." The medal felt heavier than it should. Garrett wrote letters home to the families of men in other platoons who hadn't been as lucky. He attended memorial services for crews he'd known. He trained replacements, teaching them the lessons written in blood across French fields. Trust your instinct. Scan continuously. Never assume the terrain is safe. Never assume intelligence is complete. Some learned. Some died before the lessons took root. That was war. By November, the battalion paused for refit near Aachen. Winter approached. The war, which everyone had predicted would end by Christmas, showed no signs of stopping. Germany fought with the ferocity of a cornered animal, trading space for time, men for days, hoping for a miracle that wouldn't come. On November 8th, Garrett received a letter from his fiancée. She'd heard about the decoration, heard he was safe, and begged him to stay that way. The letter smelled like home, perfume and hope, and a world that seemed impossibly distant. He read it 3 times, folded it carefully, and tucked it into his breast pocket where it would stay until the war ended or he did. That evening, sitting on the hull of his Sherman while his crew played cards, he thought about that September morning on Route Départementale 47. He thought about the choice he'd made, the careers that ended and the lives that continued because of it. He thought about Able Company's 11 dead, and the 12 crews of Charlie Company who'd gone home eventually because their captain refused an order. Was it worth it? The question tormented him. If he could have saved those 11 by sacrificing his own conscience, should he have? If obeying orders meant his men died, but disobeying meant someone else's men died instead, what was the moral calculation? There were no good answers, only the knowledge that he'd made a choice, lived with it, and would carry its weight forever. War didn't offer clean resolutions. It offered survival, scars, and the burden of decisions that seemed clear in the moment and complicated in memory. Captain John Garrett survived the war. He led his platoon through the Battle of the Bulge, across the Rhine, into the heart of Germany. He was promoted to major in March 1945. He received 2 more Bronze Stars and a Silver Star for actions he never spoke about afterward. He came home in September 1945, married his sweetheart, returned to teaching. He never spoke publicly about the war. He never wrote memoirs or gave interviews. When veterans groups invited him to speak, he politely declined. But once a year on September 14th, he drove alone to a small cemetery in Pennsylvania and stood before a memorial that listed 11 names. Able, Company's dead from that ambush he'd seen coming and hadn't been there to prevent. He never forgave himself for being right, and he never regretted the choice that let 12 other crews grow old instead. War demands impossible choices: obedience or judgment, doctrine or instinct, the letter of the law or the spirit of leadership. History remembers the battles, the strategies, the grand campaigns that shaped nations. But wars are won or lost in 10,000 small moments when individual soldiers choose between the order given and the reality they see. Captain John Garrett's refusal on that September afternoon was neither heroic nor cowardly. It was simply human. A man trusting his eyes and experience over a voice on the radio, weighing his career against the lives entrusted to him, and choosing in the only way his conscience allowed. The 80mm ambush that didn't happen, the 12 Shermans that didn't burn, the 60 men who didn't die, exists in history only as a footnote, if at all. There are no monuments to battles not fought, no memorials to soldiers not killed. The victory was silence where there might have been screaming, empty fields where there might have been pyres. But those 60 men went home. They raised families, built careers, grew old, 12 tanks fought on through the winter, across the Rhine, into the heart of a collapsing Reich. And one captain learned that the hardest courage isn't charging enemy guns, it's standing still when everyone demands you advance, trusting yourself when the world calls you wrong. The German gunners moved on to their next position, killed other men, fought their losing war with professional skill until the end. Able Company's 11 dead were buried with honor, their names carved in stone, their sacrifice remembered. Major Henshaw continued commanding, balancing trust and control, learning that perfect leadership is impossible, but good enough leadership saves lives. And the war ground forward, indifferent to individual dramas, swallowing men and machines and good intentions until finally, exhausted, it stopped. What remains is the question every soldier carries. When do you obey? And when do you refuse? When do you trust the system? And when do you trust yourself? The answer varies with each moment, each terrain, each set of lives in your hands. There is no formula, only judgment, consequences, and the weight of choices that define not whether you survive, but who you are when you do. Captain Garrett chose. 12 Shermans survived because of it. And somewhere in France, a ridge stands silent, where once an ambush waited that never found its target. A small, forgotten place where one man's instinct changed everything for the men who trusted him, and nothing for the war that swallowed them all. The ridge remains. The war is memory, but the lesson endures. Sometimes the greatest act of leadership is knowing when not to move forward, no matter who orders you to march.